I tried. No, Ejura, stay with me.
Kemi!
Everyone at the NYSC orientation camp in Kogi State believed one thing about Kemi Adeyemi, that she was a billionaire's daughter. The signs were everywhere. The designer slippers she wore to the parade ground when everyone else was in canvas. The iPhone she charged in secret because she didn't want attention. The way she disappeared every other weekend and came back smelling like airport lounges instead of camp dust. Nobody asked questions. In Nigeria, when a person carries themselves like money, you do not investigate. You assume, you admire, sometimes you plan. Because here is the truth nobody at camp knew. Kemi Adeyemi wasn't a billionaire's daughter. She was a 24-year-old cybersecurity consultant working remotely for 3 different companies in London, Toronto, and Dubai, earning in dollars while her campmates earned in the meager monthly allowance the federal government called a stipend. She built every naira with her own hands, alone, in silence. But silence, in a place like this, can be mistaken for weakness. And somewhere in that camp, in the crowd of over 2,000 strangers thrown together for 3 weeks of parades, drills, and forced friendships, someone had already decided this girl was worth something and that she was going to be taken. If you have never served in the Nigerian Youth Corps, understand this. Camp strips you down to nothing. They confiscate anything if it doesn't meet regulation. They wake you before the sun. They feed you the same watery soup, yam, beans, and rice until you dream of homemade jollof. For 3 weeks, every graduate in that camp, the University of Lagos first-class graduate, the Polytechnic HND holder, the professor's son, becomes equal. Just a number, just a khaki. It is ironically the most honest place in the country, which is why it was strange that Kemi stood out at all. She kept to herself at first, quiet in a way people mistake for pride. Then Ejura happened. Ejura Ame was everything Kemi wasn't. Loud where Kemi was reserved. Broke where Kemi appeared wealthy. Funny in the specific way that only people who have survived hard things can be funny. Laughter as armor. She adopted Kemi the way big sisters adopt strays, saving her a spot in the food line, fighting off a copper who tried to disrespect her during a platoon drill, sitting with her at night under the camp's dim security lights, gisting about ex-boyfriends and dream jobs and what Lagos would look like once camp ended. One night, over roasted corn at Mami Market, Ejura took Kemi's hand and told her, "You know you're my person, right? Whatever happens after this camp, Lagos, Abuja, wherever they post us, you're stuck with me." Kemi believed her completely. She had no idea that 400 kilometers away, in a small clinic in Kogi, a machine was beeping beside Ejura's father, a dialysis machine his family could no longer afford to keep running. Mr. Ame's kidneys had been failing for 2 years. Dialysis 3 times a week. Then a transplant became the only option, one that cost 11 million naira the family did not have. They borrowed from everyone who would lend. Then, out of desperation, they borrowed from people who should never be borrowed from. This is the part of Nigeria that polite conversation avoids. Informal lenders who charge interest that multiplies debt faster than any family can repay it. Threats delivered calmly, almost politely, the way you discuss the weather. One evening, a man cornered Ejura's younger brother outside their house and without raising his voice told him, "You go to that same school every morning at 7:15, same route, same gate. You understand me?" By then, the family owed 6 million naira on a loan that had started as 1 million naira. Then a different kind of visitor came. A well-dressed stranger found Ejura alone at Mami Market and told her quietly, "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need an introduction. Your friend, the rich one. Bring her to us and every debt your family owes disappears. Nobody touches your brother, nobody touches your father. Simple exchange. Ejura said no. She said no again the following week, and the week after that. But debt does not respect refusal. And love, the desperate, cornered kind of love a daughter has for a dying father and a frightened younger brother, has a way of rewriting a person's morality, one sleepless night at a time. 6 weeks later, Ejura said yes. By the time camp ended and postings were released, Kemi had settled into her real life, the one only she and her laptop knew about. Lagos by day, Slack calls with London by night, and somewhere in the chaos of adjusting to her place of primary assignment, she met Tunde, a businessman with shops at the computer village. He was different from the boys who usually approached her. He didn't ask what her father did, he asked what she thought about, actually thought about, late at night when nobody was performing for anybody. Once, he studied her face for a moment too long and said, "You always look like you are calculating something, even when you are smiling." He said it like a compliment, and somehow it was. He was patient, kind in a way that felt earned rather than performed, and protective, almost suspiciously so. He appeared at exactly the right moments. The night a stranger followed her too closely from the bus stop, Tunde was somehow already walking the same street. The evening a car idled outside her apartment for too long, he called, unprompted, just to check on her. And yet, he vanished for hours at a time with no explanation, took calls he immediately ended the moment she entered the room, and spoke in a low, urgent voice through closed doors that she was never quite close enough to make out. Kemi began to wonder, who exactly was this man? And why did he always seem to know when danger was near? The trap was built with love, which made it more dangerous than any trap built with hatred. Ejura invited Kemi to what she called a small gathering, a cousin's traditional engagement 2 hours outside the city. Kemi agreed instantly. Of course she did. This was Ejura, her person. They arrived at a compound that felt wrong the moment the gate closed behind them. Too quiet, too many men standing too still. And then it happened, the twist that would define everything after it. One of the men turned to Ejura, and in Igala, the language of Kogi's indigenous Igala people, a tongue few outside the region speak fluently, told her, "Keep her calm. Once the money clears, none of this concerns you anymore." Ejura answered him in the same language, fluently, naturally, without hesitation. She thought Kemi understood nothing. She was wrong. Kemi's mother had grown up in Kogi. Kemi had spent every childhood holiday in Igala-speaking villages, absorbing a language nobody thought to ask if she knew, because nobody had ever asked Kemi anything real about herself. They only saw the iPhone, the apartment, the performance of wealth. They never once asked who she actually was. In that single moment, Kemi understood every word of her own betrayal. Her best friend, her person, had sold her. And yet she did not scream, did not cry, did not accuse. She simply smiled, confused, the way a person who understands nothing would smile. Because Kemi had learned something in 4 years of remote cybersecurity work that would now save her life. The moment your enemy believes you are helpless is the moment they stop watching you closely. This is the second truth about Kemi Adeyemi that nobody at camp ever guessed. Yes, she was wealthy, genuinely, independently wealthy. Every naira earned through late nights defending foreign corporate networks from the exact kind of criminals now holding her captive. But the wealth itself was a problem the syndicate hadn't planned for. They believed they were holding a billionaire's daughter, someone whose father would simply wire the money the moment a number was named. What they were actually holding was a woman whose fortune sat in her own foreign accounts spread across 3 countries, wrapped in exactly the kind of security protocols she herself had spent years building for other people. There was no father to call. There was only Kemi. And Kemi controlled the one thing they needed. She understood immediately that the money moving too quickly would end her usefulness, and her usefulness was the only thing keeping her alive. So she gave them exactly what a frightened, cooperative hostage should give them: delays dressed up in helplessness. She told them her international accounts required a secondary verification device she didn't have on her. She told them a transfer of that size would automatically trigger a compliance freeze with her bank in London, and that fighting the freeze meant waiting for a callback window that only opened during UK business hours. She told them twice that she'd entered a passcode wrong and locked herself out for 24 hours, watching the men around her curse and threaten her and believe every word, because panic looks the same whether it's real or performed well. Every delay bought her a night. Every night bought her information. On her second night in captivity, a careless guard connected his phone to the nearest available Wi-Fi hotspot to stream a football highlight, never noticing that the hotspot belonged to Kemi's own device, hidden and still charged inside her jacket lining. He had just handed a cybersecurity consultant a door into his entire digital life. Quietly, patiently, over the following nights, Kemi began mapping the syndicate from the inside, all while feeding them just enough cooperation to keep the ransom clock frozen. Phone numbers, call patterns, locations pinged from towers, names whispered between guards who assumed their captive understood nothing and who never once suspected that the same woman stalling their payment was quietly building the case that would end them. She wasn't just surviving, she was buying time with one hand and spending it wisely with the other. Tunde was not just a businessman. He turned into an investigative journalist, one who 6 years earlier watched his own younger sister vanish under circumstances disturbingly similar to what was now happening to Kemi. No ransom note, no body, just silence, and a case file the police eventually closed for lack of evidence. Since then, Tunde had built an underground reputation chasing exactly one story: the network of syndicates preying on Nigeria's newly wealthy, newly visible young professionals, the ones who post their success online and never imagine it makes them a target. His investigation had led him almost by accident into Kemi's orbit months earlier. He hadn't approached her as a source, and she had no idea she was even on anyone's radar. He'd approached her because something about the pattern around her, men watching her building, cars idling too long, matched every case file he'd studied for 6 years. He suspected she was being marked long before she ever suspected it herself. He was protecting a woman who didn't know she needed protecting from a threat he couldn't yet prove existed. He was too late to stop. The night Kemi vanished, Tunde didn't need convincing that his instincts had been right. He needed a location. While Kemi sat in that compound, unaware that the man she'd been quietly falling for had spent days circling the exact danger she was now living inside, Tunde was on the outside, working the only lead he had, a faint familiar pattern he'd seen before, 6 years too late to save his sister, and refused to be too late for again. Neither of them knew it yet, but the same syndicate that had taken Kemi was the one Tunde had been hunting since the day his sister disappeared. His long war and her sudden nightmare had just become the same story. Ejura had made her choice weeks earlier. In a moment of desperation, she told herself she could live with. She could not live with it. Every night in that compound, watching guards bring Kemi food with the same casual cruelty you'd show livestock, something in Ejura cracked further. Then, one night, she overheard exactly what the syndicate intended to do once the ransom was paid. "Once the money clears," one of the men said, "we don't need her anymore. You know the procedure." Ejura knew the procedure. They were never going to let Kemi go. Ejura had sold her best friend to save her family, and in exchange, she had signed that same friend's death warrant. That night, something old in Ejura, the girl who had once fought off a copper for disrespecting Kemi during a camp drill, the girl who called her my person and meant it, finally overpowered the girl who had been drowning in debt and fear for months. She crept through the dark compound with trembling hands, unlocked the door to Kemi's room, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We have to go now." Kemi, who had spent weeks quietly building a digital case against every person in that compound, who had every logical reason to hate the woman standing in front of her, looked at Ejura and saw, underneath the betrayer, a frightened daughter who had run out of options long before she ever ran out of love. She took Ejura's hand. They almost made it. Gunfire cracked through the darkness as guards realized their prisoner was gone. Kemi ran, Ejura just behind her, both of them close enough to the outer gate to see headlights sweeping through the trees. Those headlights belonged to Tunde, and he wasn't there by luck. From the first night that careless guard connected to her hidden hotspot, Kemi had quietly set the device to do more than just watch. Every time that guard's phone went online, it left behind a small trace of where it was, and Kemi's hotspot silently saved that trace and sent it, bit by bit, to an online backup she'd once set up for her work laptop. It wasn't an exact address. It was more like a rough hint, a general direction, updated only whenever the guard was careless enough to log on again. Tunde had access to that backup. Months earlier, before any of this began, Kemi had added him as a trusted contact on her account. The small, ordinary intimacy of a new relationship, done without either of them imagining it would one day matter. When she disappeared, he checked it out of desperation more than hope. What he found were scattered clues. A ping here, a ping there, hours apart, all pointing somewhere in a rural part of the state. Not an address, a trail. For 2 days he barely slept, laying those scattered clues over a map, narrowing them down bit by bit, watching the picture sharpen every time the guard opened his phone to check football scores. By the second night, Tunde had it down to a handful of compounds along one stretch of road. He was already moving toward the first one when the gunfire started. The last bullet was meant for Kemi. Ejura made sure it never reached her. She shielded her as they fell together toward the gate, and as Tunde ran toward them through the chaos with armed police support, Ejura gripped Kemi's hand and with the last of her strength whispered, "Please, tell my father I tried." She didn't survive the drive to the hospital, but her testimony did, recorded days earlier on Kemi's phone during one of their quiet nights in captivity. A confession Ejura had made in secret, naming every person in the syndicate, every location, every transaction, in case she never got the courage to act. She had been building her own case against herself the entire time, hoping, somewhere underneath the fear, that the truth would outlive her mistake. It did. Kemi's evidence. Weeks of quietly mapped phone data, locations, and financial trails, combined with Tunde's 6 years of investigation and Ejura's final confession, brought the entire syndicate down. Every loan shark, every middleman, every guard who once thought a frightened, wealthy young woman understood nothing. Tunde finally published the story he had spent 6 years chasing, the one that began with his missing sister and ended unexpectedly with the woman he loved. Months later, Kemi did something with her wealth that she never needed to do. She gave it away, in the name of the girl who was once desperate enough to nearly destroy her, but still loved her enough to save her. She established a fund in Ejura's name for families facing medical debt, and Ejura's father received the letter Kemi had promised to deliver, standing in the same hospital corridor where her daughter's death had begun. Kemi and Tunde married quietly the following year, their love strengthened by what they'd fought together. And years later, a new fund recipient would walk through a hospital gate with their family without any medical debt in the name of a girl they never met but whose name they would remember for the rest of their lives. Ejura sold her friend once and then died buying her back. In the end, this was never really a story about kidnapping or money or the lies people tell about who they are. It was about the cost of forgiveness, how much harder it is to forgive the people who hurt us out of love than the people who hurt us out of hatred. Revenge is cheap. Anyone can afford it. Forgiveness, the kind Kemi gave a dying friend in the dark, the kind that turned betrayal into a legacy, that costs everything. And it was worth it.
I tried. No, Ejura, stay with me.
Kemi!